This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Kamala Harris has completely transformed the U.S. election since entering the race a month ago. Today on the podcast, we'll look at what a Harris presidency might mean in terms of policy for Latin America.
It would be a mistake to judge her by her Senate record alone. I think the 4 years that she has spent as vice president are ones in which she has learned an enormous amount. She's spoken to something like 150 world leaders. She's gone to 21 countries. And I think one of the things you see in her view of the world, and I don't think it's radically different from Biden, but I think she is all about alliances, about how do we build groups of countries to do things.
The entry of Kamala Harris into the U.S. presidential race turned a lot of plans upside down, including here at America's Quarterly. Back in April, we did an episode of this podcast, a really good one, I thought, on what a second Biden term might mean for Latin America. There was also a companion article in text in the pages of the magazine. Well, all that ended up having a shorter shelf life than we expected, let's say. So now we're back to try to do a sequel of sorts, focused this time, of course, on Kamala Harris. It's not the easiest thing to do, to be honest with you. Harris has so far been somewhat light on policy details, across the board, really, and Latin America policy is certainly no exception. But there are some clues, especially from her time as vice president. President Biden tasked Harris with a very difficult issue: to try to address the factors that make people from Central America migrate to the United States, the so-called root causes strategy. Harris received mixed reviews for her handling of that issue and seemed to back away from that portfolio somewhat as the administration went on. So, what can we learn from Kamala Harris's prior experience in Latin America? What could we expect with regards to how she sees China's presence in the region? And how might her past as a prosecutor and attorney general inform the way she handles crime and other security issues that inevitably evolve some Latin American nations? Our guest today is a great one, Roberta Jacobson, who worked with Vice President Harris directly while serving in early 2021 on the National Security Council under President Biden, overseeing the U.S. southern border policy. She is also a former ambassador to Mexico. These days, Roberta spends a lot of time explaining the U.S. to Latin Americans and vice versa, as one of the founding partners of Dinámica Américas, a consultancy firm. Roberta, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
Thanks, Brian. It's really nice to be here.
Roberta, before we get into policy, I just want to ask you about kind of the reaction to the American drama of the last month or so. You, through your consulting work, you have a lot of conversations with people in Latin America, in the private sector, in the public sector. What have you heard from them about the change at the top of the Democratic Party ticket?
Well, I think, Brian, the first thing that I've heard from most people is just confusion about, our system and how it works. And, I, like so many others who've worked in this region, really around the world, like diplomats around the world, I remember in 2000 being overseas and having to kind of scramble to make sure all of our diplomats understood exactly how the Electoral College functioned versus the popular vote, because most of our interlocutors couldn't figure out what was happening.
That was the disputed election between Bush and Gore, for those who may not have memory of that.
And the result of which lasted, months, weeks, certainly. And so I think folks in the region are not used to a little bit of confusion in the U.S., but they know what they don't know about our system. This was quite different. This was, fairly straightforward, but still very unexpected in a sense. And they were very surprised. And so I've heard from some people, regardless of which side they might support personally, some people saying, well, we thought this election was virtually over. Trump had it in the bag. There wasn't going to be a whole lot of drama. And now we're looking at something completely different, they say. And they see the change in energy in this election, whether or not they are supportive of Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. So I think that's one of the things I hear most is this is a whole new ballgame in a sense.
I think it's safe to say that in Latin America, as in the rest of the world, Kamala Harris is, generally speaking, not a known quantity. That said, and we'll get into this in more detail later in the show, but she did do some travel as vice president to Mexico and to Central American countries. Maybe these are superficial things, but what sort of commentary have you heard from people about her specifically? What are people saying, or is it just generally people shrugging and saying, gosh, we need to learn more?
Well, I think there's some of that. There's certainly some people who basically have said, whoops, I got to go back to school and learn, who she is, what she believes, et cetera. Because they felt they knew Joe Biden. Joe Biden's got, 50 years of history in the Senate and as vice president and now as president.
And a lot of travel in Latin America, especially as vice president.
I think many think of her as a prosecutor. That's something they can sort of grab onto, and that gives them a sense of her. I think the work in Central America and Mexico, in those countries, you have a better understanding of who she is, how she relates to people, her deep and abiding belief in the rule of law. There is, I have to say, just a little bit from certain areas of the region, a little bit of misogyny and maybe even racism that comes through in sort of, who is this woman and how can she be anywhere near as good as, President Biden was as a candidate? But that's fairly, minor, I would say, in terms of the numbers. For now, I think people in the hemisphere who really liked the Biden administration are inclined to like Kamala Harris and her policies or her person, and the same with Trump. I don't think there's been lots of movement, but there is lots of questions. I get huge amounts of questions about what she's like and what kind of policies she'll pursue.
Well, so let's try to get into that. Although, as I recognized in the introduction, there's so much on the policy front that we still don't know about Kamala Harris that, in her defense, that she is still sorting out. It's a relatively young candidacy in the terms of, U.S. politics, especially. I mean, there are other countries around the world that have elections in a very short period of time, but typically they have months or years to construct policy platforms rather than weeks, which is what we're seeing right now. But so that all said, Roberta, let me ask you the question that it sounds like a lot of your friends and clients are asking you. In what ways do you think a Kamala Harris administration would differ from a second Biden administration in terms of policy towards Latin America?
I would say, I guess, that there are things that I think will be very much Biden 2.0. That is, continuing to do some of the priorities that he has. I do think, and we can talk more about this in a minute, I think migration will remain fairly central in the hemisphere simply because of the numbers, largely, frankly, Venezuelans who've moved and are continuing to move. I do think there's one interesting thing. There are a number of people who've said to me, well, I didn't really see much of her from the region. They've said, I didn't see much of her as vice president. So I looked at her Senate record. And I think it would be a mistake to judge her by her Senate record alone. I think the 4 years that she has spent as vice president are ones in which she has learned an enormous amount. She's spoken to something like 150 world leaders. She's gone to 21 countries. And I think one of the things you see in her view of the world, and I don't think it's radically different from Biden, but I think she is all about alliances, about how do we build groups of countries to do things. She did that in Europe as she was sort of bolstering the alliance vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. She certainly, I think, will continue that in this hemisphere when she looks at problems, whether they be migration or political problems like Venezuela. How do we work with colleagues and allies? And she's a generational change. And so I think in some respects, you have to assume that she will really put her own stamp on Biden policies, but not necessarily radically depart from them. She has a strong interest in labor and in labor rights, and I think that will come through, as we look at a North American review of the USMCA. She's the same age as the Mexican president. And so, they sort of usher in that new generation. But I also think that you'll see, and I hope that what we'll see is someone who draws on that prosecutorial experience and her understanding, for example, of the security challenges in Latin America, whether that's guns that come from the United States or financing and money laundering. To really understand how to become partners in that is something that should be very comfortable for her. And I've seen that be comfortable for her even at the beginning of the administration.
Roberta, it seems like the clearest window that we have into her thinking about Latin America was the time that she spent working on the so-called root causes of migration. And while there's a lot to unpack here, first of all, she was focused on root causes. She was not the border czar, as the Republicans have liked to claim over the last couple of weeks. Her responsibility was at addressing the supposed causes that were driving people out of Central America specifically and into the United States. And as part of that initiative, the idea was that she would help facilitate economic development and private investment in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I have a couple of questions about this, but let's start with the important thing, which is, how would you describe that experience? In your view, was it successful? And what, if anything, does it tell us about how she would interact with the region as president if she is elected?
Well, I think, one of the handicaps of dealing with root causes is that you don't always see the results right away. But I do think that in her launch of the Partnership for Central America, and which then became the private sector entity spun off from the governmental meetings, there were billions of dollars of commitments made by major corporations, many of which are being implemented, not all, but many. And I think that understanding of partnership with the private sector and frankly, trying to draw in the local private sector in those countries, not just the international private sector, was really, really smart. And I think that it was essential moving ahead. I also think her engagement with leaders as well as civil society stood her in very good stead with a threat to democracy in Guatemala when President Arevalo seemed at risk of not actually taking the oath of office when he won the election. So I think there are things that she engaged with those leaders on in Central America that have definitely been successful. That said, we also frankly have to admit that what happened soon after this period of her engagement with Central America was a real demographic shift in migration patterns, to the extent that it wasn't just or even largely the Northern Triangle countries of Central America that made up migrants coming to the United States. So that strategy had to be adapted.
Let me ask you, though, it's true that there were these effects, these benefits that may have accrued over time, particularly in the Guatemalan democracy case, as you mentioned. But there's a widespread perception that this whole root causes strategy, that there are even questions about whether she wanted it in the first place, right? It was a difficult assignment. There's this idea that she sort of took that banner for the first year or so of the administration and then perhaps with some relief stepped away from it and was no longer quite as engaged. Is that in your view, is that kind of a misread of what happened, or do you think there's some truth to it? My impression at the time was that President Biden asked her to do this because it was something that he had done as vice president and thought, this is a concrete, important, strategically crucial portfolio that I can give her, and she will enjoy it as much as I did.
I think that may be right, but I also think that the president believes, and I think this is what the vice president came to believe quickly as well, that this is one of those very hard issues where it needs someone super high level to engage with leaders. Because short of that, as wonderful as our secretaries and our undersecretaries and our assistant secretaries may be in all of our agencies, we aren't going to get very far. So I think it was both that this was a critically important issue that he worked on, but also one where he thinks a vice presidential pulling together of the U.S. behemoth that is the interagency and these countries, which, are going to have to take some tough measures, requires. So I think that she came to realize that right away. And she asked the best questions going into this, because I was in some of those briefings as she started to play that role. And, when you've worked on things for a long time, sometimes you don't ask the obvious questions. She came at this with a freshness and a curiosity of a prosecutor and asked, why are we doing X and not Y?
I was going to ask you, what did she want to know?
Well, I think, among other things, she wanted to know to what extent were we engaging with women in these countries? When you read the statistics about female-headed household and women and children, leaving for the border, their men having gone long before that, she understood that women in these communities were often left behind and were often the most important factor in whether their kids were going to try and go north. And so she really cut to the heart of that and asked those kinds of good questions. She asked a lot of questions, obviously, about what were the reasons people were leaving? Did we understand those reasons well enough? It was a really impressive demonstration of her interest and commitment to doing it well.
And the human part of it, perhaps, that sometimes gets left out of policy.
Exactly.
So that all said, she is part of an administration that has taken a harder turn on the immigration issue so far in 2024, returning to some of the policy frameworks that we saw during the Trump years. And to some extent, it appears to be working. The numbers of people coming across the border in undocumented fashion have shrank dramatically, according to U.S. Customs and Border Patrol numbers over the last couple months. She has suggested in her speeches that she's going to maintain a tough approach to migration. There's even talk now that she may continue to dedicate funds toward the construction of border walls or barriers or whatever you want to call them. Do you think that her approach to immigration will differ or be largely the same as this final year of the Biden administration? And what kind of relationship will that produce with countries in the region that are either senders of migrants or important transport points like Mexico?
Well, I start from the understanding that I don't know exactly what her migration policy will be, but I will say a couple of things. One, when you talk about President Biden becoming tougher or this administration becoming tougher on migration, I think there is a recognition that the country as a whole has moved towards a tougher stance, and that it is important that the administration's policy reflect that. But I also think when you talk about what has worked and the numbers going down, you have to recognize that part of what has worked was a parole program for people from Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti, which gave people attempting to leave those countries a way to come into the U.S. because they were fleeing persecution, because there were so many documented cases, obviously, of a really bad situation in those countries. So I think it was, I believe, a balanced approach, right? It was both a permissive in places where the regimes were highly, highly authoritarian and committing gross human rights violations, but it was also tougher on those who perhaps did not come from those countries or were not going under any, even the most generous definition of asylum, going to be able to make their case. But what she said at the convention, and I know there may be more that comes out as a policy matter in the next couple of weeks, but I think it was very interesting. She committed to trying to get the bipartisan border security bill through Congress that was nixed by former President Trump for purely political reasons. It's the toughest one the Democrats have been willing to support in years.
Written with the help of some very prominent Republican lawmakers. I mean, this is a tough bill.
It is. And it was a lot to swallow for a lot of Democrats. But she also said, I know we can live up to our proud heritage as a nation of immigrants and reform our broken immigration system. We can create an earned pathway to citizenship and secure our borders. We must be steadfast in advancing our security and values abroad. So I think she wanted very clearly to demonstrate the balance. I recognize that it is a tougher position that this administration has taken in recent months, but in some respect, you live by the numbers, you die by the numbers. And I think what she's saying is you need both, regardless of whether those numbers are up or down.
Let me ask you a philosophical question in the middle of all of this policy. Typically, in my experience, people in Washington that deal with Latin America tend to see the region as either a threat or an opportunity. And it's very magnanimous to say, but they can be both. But in practice, I think people tend to be somewhere on that spectrum. And look, I mean, you can look at the relationships through the prism of immigration, which, as you mentioned, that it ranks in polls as the second largest concern for U.S. voters in this election, behind only the economy. So there's a reason why she's focusing on this. But do we have any indications that she can see countries in Latin America as the allies and potential partners in areas like nearshoring that you and I also know them to be?
I think she will bring that understanding to a potential presidency. One of the things that the Partnership for Central America was designed to do was provide economic development and productive employment to people in those countries. Well, that fits perfectly with the idea of nearshoring, right? We think of nearshoring as industries, manufacturers, et cetera, moving to Mexico from usually Asia. But that's not entirely true. There's no reason that many of these companies couldn't look elsewhere in the hemisphere, especially to our free trade partners, because that is what is permitted under the legislation, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act or the Chips and Science Act. And I think there's really what she was looking at was, let us look at our neighbors as nearshoring opportunities at the same time as we're looking at root causes. And I think that is the way she will, I hope, look at these things, that these countries don't offer just, frankly, people who keep our own economy running, right? Who are desperately needed in certain industries, but also people who can be, if trained, et cetera, the workforce of factories or other businesses that are moving from other places to be closer to the United States.
Roberta, generally speaking, what do we know or what have we learned about Kamala Harris's feelings about trade? It's worth noting that she opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which included Mexico, Chile, and Peru, while on the campaign trail for her California Senate seat in 2016. Of course, President Trump withdrew the United States from that organization in 2021, shortly after he was inaugurated. The Biden administration has also not been, let's say, an enthusiast when it comes to new free trade agreements. Should we expect anything different from a Harris administration?
I don't know that any president, whether it's Vice President Biden or anyone else, and I don't necessarily mean President Trump, I just mean were there other candidates, would look to have new free trade agreements. It's just so difficult in Congress. So much depends on the composition of Congress. However, I think when I was told by folks, don't look at her Senate record to see how she feels about certain issues, this was a prime one. People believe that she has changed her views on trade and that she is more open to the kinds of trade agreements as long as she ensures they are good for labor and for the environment. And we'll have the best example of that coming up as USMCA is reviewed, frankly, beginning next year when groups have to form And I think it'll be really interesting because that'll be taking place with a backdrop of the World Cup that takes place in North America in 2026. So it is a wonderful moment for North America, and I doubt she will miss that opportunity.
I want to ask you, Roberta, about a couple of specific questions, and I want to start with Mexico, given your experience as ambassador there. What do you expect from a relationship between Kamala Harris and Claudia Sheinbaum, especially given, I mean, beyond the sort of personal atmospherics of these being two women of the same age, as you point out, representing generational change, there is this potentially quite contentious process of reviewing the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, the trade agreement, and some real issues there that are happening right before our eyes at the moment, including this proposed judicial reform from President Lopez Obrador. What, beyond perhaps sort of the signs of obvious collaboration and harmony in public, what do you think, what do you expect from that relationship when it comes to the details that matter?
I actually think these are two really accomplished, very tough, if that's, if we're permitted to say that without it sounding a little bit misogynistic. I think they are tough women. They've managed tough issues, and they have, whether it's being Attorney General of the state of California, larger than many countries, or whether it's being the mayor of Mexico City with its, millions and millions of people and totally different priorities in different places. I think they will be less transactional than Lopez Obrador was. Lopez Obrador was a very transactional president. It's one of the reasons he got along with President Trump. You give me this, I give you that. That's not the same thing as a real partnership to me. And I'm hopeful that these two women will create a real partnership. The focus on climate change is an area where they can work together really productively. Sheinbaum, was on the UN panel that won the Nobel Prize. And yet her predecessor, her current president, is all about fossil fuels. I don't expect that will necessarily continue. I think it's much more likely to be an all of the above strategy on energy in some ways that the US is pursuing. But that said, I do think it's important to recognize that every once in a while, Mexican presidents have to demonstrate their independence from the United States. And the most important thing is that U.S. presidents, in a sense, ignore those moments, that they don't get sucked into a spiral of negative recriminations. And I guess I can only say that, as someone who's been both a prosecutor and a stepmother to teenagers, she's probably pretty good at ignoring people's barbs.
Let me ask you about another country that has outsized importance beyond its actual size, Cuba. Before becoming vice president, Kamala Harris did indicate support for ending the embargo. Now, as vice president, she has frequently joined President Biden in condemning the regime's violence and backing the imposition of increased sanctions on Cuban leaders. I ask about this primarily because, as I said, it's a barometer potentially for other countries at a moment where we're dealing with this crisis, this post-election crisis in Venezuela. What, if anything, does this tell us about how she will deal with some of the authoritarian leaders in the Western Hemisphere?
Oh, I mean, that's a really good question, Brian. I'm not sure that I can necessarily extrapolate from wanting to end an embargo of 70 plus years that has clearly failed to other countries. I do think that to really be brutally honest about this, the fact that Senator Menendez is no longer in the Senate is an opportunity for the region's countries who have often seen us as obsessed with Cuba to look at the hemisphere as a whole. I don't know whether the embargo will be ended. I don't know whether it should be right now. And that's from somebody who led the diplomatic negotiations to reopen diplomatic relations, which, by the way, we still have. Those haven't been broken again. But I do think that when we focus on this hemisphere, we ought to certainly be giving our attention to the human rights situation in these countries, to the importance of democracy. I am not saying that we shouldn't focus on that. But she may have been signaling that she's not among those who want our policy in the hemisphere to be driven by Cuba.
It was also a different moment. I mean, the moment of the final years of the Barack Obama presidency not only contrasted with, what's happening in the United States now, but also what's happening in the ground on Cuba, where conditions have gotten even worse. Repression of the opposition has gotten worse. And that's not even mentioning the Cuban involvement in what's happening in Venezuela.
And the truth is, so much depends on Congress and the Congress she'll be working with. I mean, unfortunately, our default position in the Congress on foreign policy, and sometimes even in the executive, is to pile more sanctions on everything. Academic studies basically prove to us that sanctions may sometimes be the right thing to do, may make you feel better, may be a moral statement that you must and should make. But in terms of creating change on the ground, they're really got a pretty bad track record.
Is there any sign she believes that too?
Well, I think in her goal for partnerships and in the desire to try and work towards, regional efforts, she will be looking for ways. Maybe others offer carrots and we offer sticks, and sometimes each of us play roles in this. But I think she understands. She's also, let's face it, she's done plea bargains too, right? She knows exactly how you have to sort of be part of a give and take, come to an agreement to get a resolution. So I would hope that there is an understanding, not only that sanctions need to be used judiciously, but also that sometimes working with partners of ours who may have more, frankly, permissive views than we do. And it doesn't mean we share the exact same views, but it does mean that we are able to present, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua, with a bit more of a united front to try and get something done.
Final question for you, Roberta. We've been talking about Latin America, but it's clear that one of the strategic issues that will define her presidency will be the U.S. Strategic competition or rivalry with China. And, Latin America is, for better or for worse, one of the theaters for that competition around the world. What do we know about how Kamala Harris sees China, and what does she understand and what should she understand about how that competition is playing out right now in many Latin American countries?
Well, I'm not sure I know exactly what she thinks about China's activities or engagement in the region, although, again, looking at her foreign policy views during the convention, she talked about moving America forward, sort of enabling America to have the best of technology and whether it's AI or other things. And she said, enabling the U.S. to be the best at this and not China, right? So she understood that duality. There are many, many in the hemisphere who don't want to have to be presented with a choice, right? Who do not feel comfortable with an us or them. And I think from my perspective, that is the crucial issue, is understanding two things. One, that it isn't us or them, that you have to play this smart, that there is engagement by China that is positive for all of us in terms of whether it's trade. But the second is that you can't beat something with nothing. We have to engage more in the hemisphere. And that means including our private sector to be able to offer the investment and the support that China is offering. And we don't have the state-owned enterprises to do that. So we have to just try and level the playing field.
That sounds a lot like the way the Biden administration has framed this as well. I mean, they have understood both through their actions and their rhetoric that a lot of these countries are making choices about, trade and investment. They think that they can either deal with both, sometimes play both sides against each other to their own benefit. But that knowledge has been paired with this view that I hear all the time, I'm sure you've heard all the time, that the Biden administration was another administration that did not pay enough attention to the region.
Well, you're not going to get somebody who spent their whole life working on Latin America to say that I can think of any administration in recent history that's really paid enough attention to the region. I obviously think everyone should pay more attention, whether it's for reasons of climate change or critical minerals or food security or a whole raft of other issues that this hemisphere excels at. But I do think that, we do have a tendency to look at this hemisphere as being less of a threat because it's non-nuclear. And when you talked about threats and opportunities, right, threats always get your attention first, right? The house that's on fire today gets your attention. But I would ask you, in what universe where 100,000 people die from opioids every year, if that were a war, would we not put that at the top of our agenda? And so, and let's remember that similar numbers as a percentage of the total are also dying in these countries, whether it's from cartel violence or gangs or other things, or just criminality. So there are issues we ought to be able to elevate in our agenda with this region, and not just elevate them because they're problems for us, because they're shared problems. And because unless we actually act together, that is criminals and organized crime in general, is going to keep exploiting our differences for their benefit.
Roberta, thank you so much for joining us on the AQ podcast.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.